I'm John Koza from the Computer Science Department at Stanford University. My first book, Genetic Programming, on the programming of computers by means of natural selection, began to address the question of how to get a computer to learn to solve a problem without explicitly programming it. It provided evidence that genetic programming can evolve programs that solve or approximately solve a variety of problems, and that computers can be programmed by means of natural selection. Genetic programming accomplishes this by starting with a primordial ooze of randomly generated programs of different sizes and shapes, each composed of the programmatic ingredients appropriate to the problem. The population of computer programs is genetically bred using the Darwinian principle of survival of the fittest and the genetic operation of sexual recombination, called crossover. Each program in the population is evaluated as to how well it solves the problem at hand. Programs are probabilistically selected from the population based on their fitness, so that a more fit program has a better chance of being selected. The reproduction operation creates a copy of the selected program. In the crossover operation, two parental programs are probabilistically selected from the population based on fitness. The parents participating in crossover are usually of different sizes and shapes. A crossover point is randomly selected in the first parent and the second parent. Then the subtrees below the crossover points are exchanged, thus producing two new offspring programs. The offspring are syntactically valid executable programs, which usually differ from both of their parents in size and shape and content. A new generation of computer programs is thus produced. Over a period of many generations, the fitness of the population as a whole and the fitness of the best single individual in the population typically improve. Eventually, a computer program may emerge that solves or approximately solves the problem. 81 problems are solved in this manner with genetic programming in my first book, of which 21 can be seen in the videotape accompanying that book. My second book extends the results from the first book to larger and more difficult problems. In particular, the focus of Genetic Programming 2 is on the hierarchical exploitation of regularities, symmetries, homogeneities, and modularities of problem environments. Complex systems in the real world typically contain massive amounts of regularity. Understanding, designing, and constructing large systems requires, as a practical matter, the leverage gained from the exploitation of these regularities. For example, designers of microprocessor chips reuse certain standard circuits, each performing a certain elementary function throughout the chip. Computer programmers invoke a similar process of reuse when they make multiple calls to a subroutine from a calling program. For example, design of a microprocessor chip containing thousands of occurrences of a standard cell would be impractical if the chip designer had to start from the first principles of electronic design and separately think through the design of each cell on each occasion when it is needed. Similarly, writing computer programs would be impractical if programmers had to reinvent, from scratch, the code for the square root, cosine, array access, file handling, and printing on each separate occasion when they needed these functions. Humans contain trillions of cells whose structure is specified by only a few billion bits of information contained in the individual's DNA. The three-dimensional coordinates of each atom, contained in each protein, contained in each copy of the protein, contained in each cell, are not explicitly listed in the DNA. Instead, there is a massive reuse of certain basic constructions. In proteins, these basic constructions include alpha helices, 4 of which are shown here, and 8 of which are shown here, and these 16 beta strands. Suppose a programmer needed to write a computer program to cause a lawnmower to mow all 64 squares of a lawn. The lawnmower is capable of turning left, of moving forward 1 square in the direction which it is currently facing, and mowing the grass it finds there, and of jumping a specified displacement in the horizontal and vertical directions and mowing the grass it finds there. The function set and terminal sets of this problem therefore contain the operations of turning, moving, and jumping, and various numerical constants. Fitness is measured by the amount of lawn that is mowed within some reasonable amount of time. Genetic programming is capable of evolving a computer program that causes the lawnmower to visit all 64 squares of the lawn. This 100% correct evolved program, containing 296 functions and terminals, is close to the average size of the programs created by genetic programming for this problem. The trajectory of this lawnmower, as it visits all 64 squares, is irregular, opportunistic, difficult to follow, but 100% effective. This 296-point genetically evolved program does not take advantage of the obvious homogeneity of this problem environment. Instead, each part of the overall task is dealt with individually, as if it presented a unique challenge that had never been seen before. A human programmer would approach this problem very differently, by decomposing the problem into subproblems, each perhaps consisting of mowing of one column, then solving the subproblem of mowing a column, and then solving the overall problem by assembling the multiple invocations of the solution to the subproblem. I believe that the goal of getting computers to learn to solve non-trivial problems without being explicitly programmed requires the hierarchical reuse of regularities, symmetries, homogeneities, and modularities of problem environments. Large problems are not going to be solved by individually crafting each minute part of the overall solution. Hierarchical organization and reuse are required if automatic programming is ever to be scaled up from small problems to large problems. Of course, the hierarchical decomposition need not be the one that a human programmer would employ. Once a subproblem is identified and solved, the solution to the subproblem is repeatedly exploited in order to solve the overall problem. Genetic programming is capable of evolving a population of multi-part programs consisting of a main result-producing branch and one or more function-defining branches. Each function-defining branch defines what we call an automatically defined function, or ADF. An automatically defined function is a function, or if you like, a subroutine, procedure, or module that is dynamically evolved during a run of genetic programming, and which may be called by a calling program that is simultaneously being evolved. The main result-producing branch of the overall program is typically composed of the primitive functions of the problem, the actual variables of the problem, random constants, and the various automatically defined functions. The result-producing branch typically makes repeated calls to the automatically defined functions. The first automatically defined function, ADF0, is typically composed of the primitive functions of the problem, random constants, and one or more dummy variables, that is, formal parameters, that can be instantiated by the calling branch. The second automatically defined function, ADF1, typically refers hierarchically to the now defined ADF0, so that the function set of ADF1 contains the primitive functions of the problem and the now defined function ADF0. In implementing genetic programming with automatically defined functions, each individual in the initial random population must be created in accordance with the constrained syntactic structure just described. This constrained syntactic structure must then be preserved when crossover is performed. After the two parents are selected to participate in structure-preserving crossover on the basis of fitness, a crossover point is randomly chosen, without restriction, from the first parent. In what we call branch typing, each branch of the overall program is treated as a different type, and the choice of the crossover point in the second parent is then restricted to a point of the same type as the now chosen point from the first parent. Crossover then proceeds in the usual way by exchanging the subtrees below the crossover point, as shown here for the crossover within two result-producing branches, and similarly when the crossover point is in the function-defining branches. When the crossover point is in a function-defining branch, and the automatically defined function is repeatedly referenced by other branches, the effect of the crossover is leveraged. Here's an average size solution to the Lawnmower problem that was evolved by genetic programming with automatically defined functions. The result-producing branch of this program repeatedly invokes its automatically defined functions, ADF0 and ADF1, to produce this row mowing behavior. This genetically evolved program mows 4 consecutive squares in a northerly direction, shifts one column to the west, and then does the same thing in the next column. While the row mower broke the overall task into 8 subtasks, this particular program decomposes the problem into 16 subtasks, each involving mowing 4 squares of lawn. Only about half of the genetically evolved programs are row and column mowers. Zigzaggers and swirlers are the next most common programming style created by genetic programming, accounting for about another 20% each. Crisscrossers like this one further illustrate the way that genetic programming with automatically defined functions varies considerably from run to run. This jumping column mower again makes the point that there are many different ways of exploiting the homogeneities and symmetries of a problem environment. The fact that human programmers find it beneficial to decompose a problem into repeatedly occurring subtasks suggests the possibility that the computational effort required for a computer to learn the solution to a problem might be reduced if the learning mechanism can reuse the solution to a repeatedly occurring subtask. One way to test this possibility is to compare the just sufficient number of fitness evaluations required to solve a problem by means of genetic programming with and without automatically defined functions. The cumulative probability that a run of genetic programming without automatically defined functions yields a solution to the 64-square lawnmower problem rises from generation to generation. Genetic programming is a probabilistic algorithm involving the random creation of the initial population, random selection based on fitness of individuals to participate in the genetic operations, and random choices of crossover points. Consequently, not all runs of genetic programming are successful within a predetermined number of generations with a predetermined population size. Thus, the computational effort must be computed in a way that accounts for this probabilistic behavior. The cumulative probability of success reaches about 92% around generations 49 and 50 of this problem. When automatically defined functions are used, holding the population size and other parameters constant, the probability of success reaches 100% by generation 10 over 76 runs. One way to quantify the performance of a particular series of runs of a probabilistic algorithm is to measure the number of fitness evaluations required to solve the problem with 99% probability by each generation. The minimum point is the just sufficient number of fitness evaluations and is called the computational effort. The computational effort is 11,000 with automatically defined functions versus 100,000 without automatically defined functions. The better performance with automatically defined functions is obvious, a 9-to-1 improvement. The efficiency ratio comparing the computational effort is 9.09 for this problem. Since this ratio is greater than 1, less computational effort is required with automatically defined functions than without them, and automatically defined functions are seen to be beneficial for this problem. The average size of the evolved 100% correct solutions is 280.8 without automatically defined functions versus only 76.9 with them. The structural complexity ratio, comparing the average size of the evolved solutions, is therefore 3.65. Since this ratio is greater than 1, the evolved solutions are smaller, that is more parsimonious, with automatically defined functions than without them. In other words, automatically defined functions were beneficial in terms of both computational effort and parsimony for this problem. Automatically defined functions improve performance because they in effect hierarchically decompose the overall problem into subproblems, and because the solutions to the subproblems can then be reused in assembling the solution of the overall problem. Parity functions are often used to check the accuracy of stored or transmitted binary data in computers because a change in the value of any one of its arguments toggles the value of the function. Because of this sensitivity to its inputs, the parity function is difficult to learn and is often used as a benchmark in the fields of machine learning and neural networks. Genetic programming can, of course, evolve a computer program for the 3 parity function, composed of a computationally complete set of primitive functions, such as AND, OR, NAND, and NOR operating on the program's inputs, and the terminals D0, D1, and D2. The fitness of a program in the population is the number of times that it correctly mimics the parity function for all possible combinations of inputs. Similarly, genetic programming can solve higher-order parity problems, such as the 4 parity problem and the 5 parity problem. However, a human programmer would likely approach the 3 parity problem by writing a subroutine for the 2 parity function and then write a main result-producing program for the required 3 parity function. The subroutine, or function definition, or procedure, or defun, is the solution to the subproblem of solving the lower-order 2 parity problem. The result-producing branch of the overall program repeatedly invokes the 2 parity function in solving the 3 parity problem. Humans find it easier to write programs to solve complicated problems by using this hierarchical and modular approach. This hierarchical approach would seem to be useful in achieving the goal of enabling computers to solve problems without explicitly programming them. We should gain some leverage in automating the problem-solving process if we can reuse the solutions to repeatedly occurring subproblems, instead of expending the effort of resolving them on every occasion when they occur. When genetic programming solves the even 3 parity problem with automatically defined functions, the first automatically defined function, ADF0, in this particular run, turns out to be the odd 2 parity or exclusive OR function. ADF1 has the ability to call ADF0 because ADF0 is one of the ingredients of the function set of ADF1. However, we need not be concerned about what ADF1 does, since the result-producing branch of this particular overall program ignores ADF1. The result-producing branch calls ADF0 twice. Looking at this same evolved solution as a rooted point-labeled tree with ordered branches, we see the first function-defining branch, ADF0, the second function-defining branch, ADF1, and the result-producing branch. The result-producing branch contains the actual variables of the problem, D0, D1, and D2. These are the inputs to the overall evolved computer program. The value produced by the result-producing branch is the output of the computer program. The function-defining branches contain dummy variables or formal parameters, such as arg0 and arg1. The dummy variables are instantiated with values of the actual variables of the problem when the result-producing branch calls ADF0 the first time. The 2 arguments to the second call to ADF0 consist of the computed value NOR D2 D2 and the now known value ADF0 of D1 D0 obtained from the first invocation of ADF0. The computational effort for the 3 parity problem without automatically defined functions is 96,000, but only 64,000 with ADFs, as shown on the right half of this summary graph, so that the efficiency ratio is 1.5. For the 4 parity problem, the computational effort without automatically defined functions is 384,000, but only 176,000 with ADFs, so that the efficiency ratio is 2.18. For the 5 parity problem, the computational effort without ADFs is 6,528,000, but only 464,000 with ADFs, so that the efficiency ratio is 14. For the 6 parity problem, we estimate the computational effort without ADFs to be around 70 million versus only 1.3 million with ADFs, so that the efficiency ratio is about 52. Although we cannot solve higher order parity problems without automatically defined functions with the same population size and number of generations that we've been using, we can easily solve the 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 parity problems when we add automatically defined functions to our toolkit. In fact, we can do so with a much smaller population size. Genetic programming evolved the first branch of this 100% correct solution to the 11 parity problem to be a function definition for the even 2 parity function. In the second branch, genetic programming evolved a function definition for the even 4 parity function using the now available even 2 parity function. Both of these lower order parity functions were dynamically discovered, on the fly, as was the incorporation of the first defined function into the second function definition. The third branch of this 100% correct solution employs both of the dynamically defined lower order parity functions in order to solve the 11 parity problem. You can see this in tree form. Thus, hierarchical automatic function definition has solved the 11 parity problem. When automatically defined functions are used in conjunction with genetic programming, the results can be interpreted as if a hierarchical 3-step problem-solving process is being applied to the problem. First, the original problem is decomposed into subproblems. Second, the subproblems are solved. Third, the problem is solved by assembling the solutions to the subproblems. The total effort required to decompose the problem into subproblems, solve the subproblems, and assemble the solutions to the subproblems into a solution to the overall problem often proves to be less than the effort required to solve the original problem without the aid of the hierarchical process. Automatically defined functions can be beneficial when the problem environment contains only a modest amount of regularity. In the artificial ant problem, food is located along an irregular trail with single and double gaps along the trail, and single and double gaps at the corners, and spots where the trail is displaced 1 space to the left or right of the current trail, and spots where the trail is displaced 2 spaces to the left or right of the current trail. Fitness is the amount of food eaten. A controller for finding all the food could be written by handling each type of irregularity as if it were a unique, never-to-be-seen-again problem. That's in effect what happens when automatically defined functions are not used. However, a human programmer would probably devise a single inspecting motion and reapply it on both the left and right sides of the trail. Although there is not as much exploitable symmetry in this problem as in the lawnmower and parity problems, these trajectories of evolved programs employing automatically defined functions show reuse of an evolved subprogram. There is a 2-to-1 improvement in the computational effort when automatically defined functions are used, from 272,000 to 136,000 fitness evaluations. When the bumblebee has to visit 25 flowers, genetic programming without automatically defined functions evolved this 525-point program that performs the task. The available functions and terminals enabled the bee to make decisions based on floating point coordinates and navigate in its 2-dimensional world. Fitness is the number of flowers visited. However, this much smaller 219-point program, evolved using automatically defined functions, executes the required tour in a more orderly and repetitive style on this first fitness case, as well as on the second one. The computational effort is 612,000 without automatically defined functions, but only 192,000 with them, for an efficiency ratio of 3.2. When the problem requires finding the impulse response function for a linear time-invariant system, genetic programming can find a good approximation to the required impulse response function, using a fitness measure that sums the squares of the differences between the observed discrete time domain response of the system to a square input forcing function, and the response being computed by convolving the forcing function and the genetically evolved impulse response function. The computational effort without ADFs is 1,120,000, but only 768,000 with ADFs, for an efficiency ratio of 1.46. When the robot must mop the entire floor, but not waste too much time bumping into posts, genetic programming without automatically defined functions evolves solutions that perform the task in an irregular way, after an expenditure of computational effort consisting of 784,000 fitness evaluations. When automatically defined functions are used, the robot's trajectories are more regular, as can be seen from these two fitness cases. The computational effort is only 240,000 with automatically defined functions, so the efficiency ratio is 3.27. In the minesweeper problem, the computational effort is 1,428,000 without automatically defined functions, but only 208,000 with them, so the efficiency ratio is 6.87. The conclusion that summarizes all of our observations to date is part of one of the main points of genetic programming 2, namely that genetic programming with automatically defined functions is capable of solving problems. Another of the main points of genetic programming 2 is that automatically defined functions discover and exploit the regularities, symmetries, homogeneities, similarities, patterns, and modularities of problem environments in varied ways that are very different from the style employed by human programmers. We now make a series of runs, with and without automatically defined functions, of the Lawnmower problem with 32, 48, 64, 80, and 96 squares of lawns, and a series of runs of the Bumblebee problem with 10, 15, 20, and 25 flowers, and a series of runs of the 3, 4, 5, and 6 Parity problem, and a series of runs of the artificial ant, impulse response, obstacle avoiding robot, and minesweeper problems shown in this videotape. When we do this, we see that genetic programming requires less computational effort to yield a solution with 99% probability to each version of each of these problems with automatically defined functions than without them. That is, the efficiency ratios are greater than 1 for all 17 of these regularity-containing problems. The only exceptions that we observed to date concerning computational effort share an interesting characteristic. We applied genetic programming, with and without automatically defined functions, to a simple and scaled-up version of 4 problems, and computed an efficiency ratio for each of these situations. More computational effort was required without ADFs than with them for the 4 scaled-up versions, so the efficiency ratios were greater than 1. However, the opposite was true for the simpler versions of each pair of the problems. The problems were a symbolic regression of a quintic versus a sextic polynomial, a Boolean 5 symmetry versus a 6 symmetry function, a sum of 3 versus 4 sinusoidal harmonics, and an expression with 3 occurrences of pi versus one with 4 occurrences. In other words, each of the 4 problems appears to straddle a break-even point for computational effort. The conclusion that summarizes all of our observations to date is main point 3 of genetic programming 2, namely that genetic programming requires less computational effort to yield a solution to a problem with automatically defined functions than without them, provided the difficulty of the problem is above a certain relatively low break-even point. It is not always true that hierarchical decomposition is beneficial in terms of reducing the computational effort required to evolve a solution. A comparison of the simpler Boolean 5-symmetry problem and the slightly more difficult 6-symmetry problem shows why this is the case. In order to declare these 6 bits to be symmetric, a program for the Boolean 6-symmetry function must compare the first and last of the 6 inputs, both 1 here, and the second and fifth inputs, both 0 here, and the third and fourth inputs, both 1. When automatically defined functions are available, genetically evolved programs often solve this problem by evolving a test for equivalence in the function-defining branch, reusing that test 3 times, and then conjoining the results of the 3 comparisons in the result-producing branch. As we have already seen, automatically defined functions are beneficial in terms of computational effort for the 6-symmetry problem. The 5-symmetry problem can also be solved by genetic programming using automatically defined functions. However, a program for the 5-symmetry function need only make 2 comparisons in order to declare the 5 bits to be symmetric. With only 2 opportunities to reuse the evolved automatically defined function, ADFs prove to be non-beneficial in terms of computational effort for the 5-symmetry problem. It appears that the overhead associated with automatically defined functions makes them non-beneficial for problems that are too simple. Future research will no doubt sharpen, qualify, and unify these empirical observations about computational effort and perhaps uncover other non-beneficial categories. Returning to the same 17 problems, the average size of the programs that were evolved without automatically defined functions were larger than those evolved with automatically defined functions for 16 of these 17 problems. That is, the structural complexity ratios are greater than 1 for 16 of the 17 problems. The exception is the simplest problem of the 17, namely the even 3 parity problem. This conclusion holds for 2 of the 4 scaled-up versions of the 4 additional problems previously shown, but does not hold for the other 2. The conclusion that summarizes all of our observations to date is one of the main points of genetic programming too, namely that genetic programming usually yields solutions with smaller overall size with automatically defined functions than without them, provided the difficulty of the problem is above a certain break-even point for average structural complexity. This result was not expected when we started our investigations of automatically defined functions. In fact, the possibility of achieving parsimony in evolved programs is an especially welcome surprise, given the opacity of many genetically evolved programs. This generally true observation will no doubt be further sharpened by future research. When we compare the average size of the evolved solutions of the Lawnmower problem for lawn sizes of 32, 48, 64, 80, and 96, with and without automatically defined functions, we find that straight lines are good fits to both sequences of data. When automatically defined functions are not being used, starting from a negligible y-intercept of only 13, it takes an approximately an additional 4.2 points in the program tree to mow each additional square of lawn. However, when automatically defined functions are used, starting from a much larger y-intercept of 56 points, it takes only about an additional 0.3 of a point in the program tree to mow each additional square of lawn. This can be interpreted to mean that there's a substantial fixed overhead in terms of size associated with automatically defined functions, but relatively little additional cost associated with growth in problem size for this problem. Conversely, there is much less fixed overhead without automatically defined functions, but a substantial additional cost associated with growth in problem size. The conclusion that summarizes our observation for this problem, as well as the two other problems for which a progression of scaled-up versions have been studied, is one of the main points of genetic programming too, namely that the average size of the solutions produced by genetic programming increases as a function of problem size at a lower rate with automatically defined functions than without them. When we compare the computational effort required to yield a solution of the lawnmower problem for lawn sizes of 32, 48, 64, 80, and 96, with and without automatically defined functions, we find that the computational effort without automatically defined functions grows explosively and nonlinearly as a function of problem size. Computational effort grows much more slowly with problem size with ADFs. The conclusion that summarizes our observation for this problem, as well as the other two problems for which a progression of scaled-up versions have been studied, is that the number of fitness evaluations required by genetic programming to yield a solution to the problem increases as a function of problem size at a lower rate with automatically defined functions than without them. In fact, a straight line is a very good fit to the computational effort with automatically defined functions for the lawnmower problem. When we compare the average size of the evolved solutions to the 3, 4, 5, and 6 parity problems, with and without automatically defined functions, we find that straight lines are good fits to both sequences of data. However, the slope is less with automatically defined functions than without them, so we can again say that the average size of the solutions produced by genetic programming increases as a function of problem size at a lower rate with automatically defined functions than without them for this problem. When we compare computational effort required to yield a solution to the 3, 4, 5, and 6 parity problems with and without automatically defined functions, we again see that computational effort without automatically defined functions grows explosively and nonlinearly as a function of problem size. We can again say that the computational effort increases as a function of problem size at a lower rate with automatically defined functions than without them for this problem. When we compare the average size of the evolved solutions to the Bumblebee problem with 10, 15, 20, and 25 flowers, with and without automatically defined functions, we can again say that the average size of the solutions produced by genetic programming increases as a function of problem size at a lower rate with automatically defined functions than without them for this problem. When we compare the computational effort for the Bumblebee problem with 10, 15, 20, and 25 flowers, with and without automatically defined functions, we can again say that the computational effort without automatically defined functions grows explosively and nonlinearly as a function of problem size. The efficiency ratios and structural complexity ratios provide another way to look at the data that we have accumulated for the three problems for which a progression of scaled-up versions have been studied. The efficiency ratio is the ratio of the computational effort without ADFs to the computational effort with ADFs. As can be seen, the efficiency ratio increases with problem size for the parity problems, and the lawnmower problems, and the Bumblebee problems. The structural complexity ratio is the ratio of the structural complexity without ADFs to the structural complexity with ADFs. As can be seen, the structural complexity ratio increases with problem size for the parity problems, and the lawnmower problems, and the Bumblebee problems. The conclusion that summarizes our observation for the parity problems, the lawnmower problems, and the Bumblebee problems is that the advantages as to computational effort and parsimony conferred by automatically defined functions increase as the problem size is scaled up. Two of the three problems for which a progression of scaled-up versions were studied did not employ optimizations that distorted wall clock time. The wall clock ratio is defined similarly to the efficiency ratio. For the lawnmower problem, These ratios are above 1 for all versions of the problem, as they also are for the Bumblebee problem. Moreover, the advantages as to wall clock time conferred by automatically defined functions increase as the problem size is scaled up. Many problems of recognition and prediction call for the simultaneous discovery of initially unknown feature detectors and a way of combining the just discovered detectors. In this letter recognition problem, the result-producing branch of the genetically evolved program controls the motion of a turtle that can move around the entire 6x4 pixel area. The turtle sees only the single pixel at its current location in the overall area. What the turtle sees changes as it moves. The 5 genetically evolved feature detectors see the 3x3 subarea of pixels centered at the turtle's current location. So what they see changes as the turtle moves. Within the 3x3 subarea centered at the turtle's current location, each of the 5 genetically evolved detectors can detect the presence of zeros and ones at certain locations, or can ignore certain locations. For example, the 5th genetically evolved detector shown here is sensitive to the 7 pixels shown here in blue, and is a reasonably effective detector for a vertical line segment. Let's examine how 100% correct genetically evolved pattern recognizing program successfully identifies patterns of pixels as being the letter L, I, or neither. The result-producing branch moves the turtle through a series of steps on the vertical part of this L. At time step 9, the result-producing branch invokes the 5th detector to detect for the presence of a vertical line segment. At time step 22, the result-producing branch invokes the 4th genetically evolved feature detector and detects the presence of a corner. At time step 23, the result-producing branch invokes yet another genetically evolved feature detector and detects the right end of a horizontal line segment. The pattern is thus identified and classified as the letter L. The result-producing branch identifies the letter I by twice invoking the genetically evolved detector for a vertical line segment and excluding the possibility of the letter L by using the 2nd feature detector. And the 4th detector. This negative example comprising an imperfect version of the letter L is quickly dispatched by means of the invocation of the 1st genetically evolved detector. And this imperfect version of the letter I is similarly quickly dispatched, as are other negative cases. The genetically evolved result-producing branch successfully identifies the letters I and L and the negative cases by invoking different combinations of the genetically evolved detectors. When automatically defined functions are used in conjunction with genetic programming, the results can be interpreted as if a hierarchical 3-step problem-solving process is being applied to the problem. We have previously described this 3-step process in a top-down way, involving decomposing a problem into subproblems. However, this process can also be viewed in a bottom-up way. The foregoing letter recognition problem illustrates this alternative view. In this view, we first try to discover useful regularities and patterns at the lowest level of the problem environment. Second, we change the representation of the problem and restate it in terms of its inherent regularities and patterns, thus creating a new problem. Third, we solve the presumably simpler recoded problem. Living things are composed of thousands of different task-performing proteins. The behavior and function of a protein arises from the three-dimensional locations of its atoms. Some classification problems in biochemistry and molecular biology call for the simultaneous discovery of initially unknown detectors and a way of combining the just discovered detectors. The techniques from the letter recognition problem may be relevant to such classification problems. These 58 characters over the 20-letter alphabet of amino acids constitute the primary structure of a particular small protein, bovine pancreatic trypsin inhibitor. Broadly speaking, the linear sequence of the constituent amino acids of a protein completely determine its three-dimensional or tertiary structure. The primary structures of tens of thousands of proteins are now accumulating in computerized databases, and many biologically important questions call for discovering relationships in these massive databases, including questions involving the relationship between the structure and function of proteins. For example, the 58-character primary structure of BPTI determines the presence of these two spiral staircase secondary structures called alpha helices, and these two beta strand secondary structures, and the fact that these three pairs of distant amino acids along the backbone become covalently bonded together by disulfide bonds as the protein is being manufactured. A transmembrane protein is a protein that is embedded in a membrane in such a way that part of the protein is located on one side of the membrane, part is within the membrane, and part is on the opposite side of the membrane. For example, the transmembrane protein bacteriorhodopsin begins outside the cell. There are subsequences within this 248 residue protein that are embedded in the cellular membrane. These 7 transmembrane domains are connected by relatively short loops, 3 on the outside of the cell and 3 on the inside. The protein ends inside the cell. If the membrane is viewed as a mattress, the 7 transmembrane domains can be viewed as springs. The question arises as to whether a computer program can learn to identify whether or not a protein segment is a transmembrane domain, merely by seeing correctly classified examples. For example, this 24 residue segment from positions 96 to 119 of mouse peripheral myelin protein 22 is a transmembrane domain, while this 27 residue segment from positions 35 to 61 is not. Plotting the moving average of the hydrophobicity values of the 20 amino acids is a good way to locate some transmembrane domains. Suppose, however, that we knew nothing in advance about the biological concept of hydrophobicity. Could we evolve a multi-part computer program containing one or more automatically defined functions, an iteration-performing branch, and a result-producing branch that is capable of correctly making this classification? The automatically defined functions might be used to form subsets of the amino acid residues. The iteration-performing branch might contain arithmetic operations, conditional operations, settable variables, setting functions to permit intermediate results of the iteration to be remembered, and other ingredients. The result-producing branch might perform various conditional and arithmetic operations on the remembered values of the settable variables to reach a decision. Using correlation as the fitness measure and hundreds of protein segments as fitness cases, genetic programming with automatically defined functions evolved a classifying program with a slightly better error rate than 4 benchmark algorithms for performing this classification task. Summarizing this evolved algorithm, if the number of occurrences of leucine and isoleucine in a given protein segment exceed the number of occurrences of aspartic acid, glutamic acid, lysine, arginine, glutamine, asparagine, and proline, classify the segment as a transmembrane domain. Otherwise, classify it as a non-transmembrane area. Positions 26 to 35 of the 71 residue cobra neurotoxin venom protein form an omega-shaped loop hanging off the main body of the protein into the solvent that surrounds the protein. Genetic programming has also evolved a classifying program for classifying whether a given protein segment is an omega loop. Prior to applying genetic programming, it is necessary to specify the ingredients of the computer programs that are to be evolved, that is, the inputs or terminals, and the functions or operations. In addition, it is also necessary to specify the fitness measure for driving the evolutionary process or to provide a suitable simulation environment for implicitly defining the fitness of individuals in the population. Certain key parameters, such as population size and the number of generations, must be specified, along with the criteria for terminating a run and the method for designating the result of a run. When automatically defined functions are being used, the architecture of the overall program must also be determined. This sixth major preparatory step involves determining the number of function-defining branches, the number of arguments possessed by each function-defining branch, that is, the argument map for the ADFs, and, if there's more than one function-defining branch, the nature of the hierarchical references, if any, allowed between the function-defining branches. The architecture may be specified by analyzing the nature of the problem. For example, perhaps one knows or suspects that a certain lower dimensional subspace exists for the problem, or wishes to force the result to include a subspace of a certain dimensionality. One often overspecifies the number of function-defining branches and the available number of arguments. Overspecification often works, and we have already seen several examples of available dummy arguments of an ADF being ignored, of available ADFs being ignored, and of available opportunities to reference already defined ADFs being ignored. The practical reality is that considerable additional computer resources, both time and memory, are required by each additional function-defining branch, each additional argument, and each additional occasion where one ADF can call another hierarchically. As a practical matter, the architecture of the overall program is often determined by the rule of hoping that the capacity that we can afford to devote to the problem proves to be sufficient to solve the problem. If you are dealing with a number of related problems, a retrospective analysis of one problem may provide guidance for making the required architectural choice for a similar problem. A retrospective analysis can also be used to determine the optimum architecture. We made a series of runs of the even 5 parity problem using each of 15 different architectures, with between 1 and 5 automatically defined functions, each taking between 2 and 4 arguments. The first important thing that we found is that the problem is solvable for all 15 architectures. The required computational effort varied between a low of 272,000 to a high of 912,000 fitness evaluations. The optimal number of 272,000 is attained for both 2 2-argument automatically defined functions and 3 3-argument automatically defined functions. We then made a series of runs without automatically defined functions and found that 1,632,000 fitness evaluations are required. All 15 of the values of computational effort with automatically defined functions were less than the 1,632,000 fitness evaluations required without automatically defined functions, and the efficiency ratios range from 2.2 to 6.0. In other words, the decision to use automatically defined functions on the problem was far more important than the decision of which architecture to use. However, if you are unable or unwilling to make the architectural choice, it is possible to allow a fitness-driven evolutionary process to make the selection for you. Starting with an architecturally diverse population containing random programs configured to random architectures, it is possible to simultaneously evolutionarily select the architecture while solving the problem. The green skyscrapers in the back show the presence of approximately equal numbers of programs with between 0 and 5 automatically defined functions in generation 0. each ADF taking an independently randomly chosen number of arguments. Using a more refined method of typing, called point typing, on potential crossover points in each parent, structure-preserving crossover is then performed so as to guarantee that architecturally different parents will sire syntactically and semantically valid offspring. This evolutionary, fitness-driven process will cause certain suitably configured individuals to prosper in the population, while individuals in the population with architectures that are less suitable for the problem at hand will tend to wither away, eventually leading to the emergence of a solution to the problem with a certain architecture. The best of generation programs often trace an indirect trajectory through the space of the number of arguments possessed by each automatically defined function. Sometimes many architectures become extinct in the population so that 100% of the population has the same number of ADFs. For example, the dominance of the pink skyscraper at the front indicates that all members of this population have 4 ADFs. In other runs, the population may bifurcate or divide in other ways, as shown here by the 2 yellow skyscrapers at the front. This fitness branch trajectory shows the progressive change in the number of ADFs and fitness over the generations for one particular run. We have thus seen how genetic programming can simultaneously evolutionarily select the architecture of the overall program while solving a problem. When automatically defined functions are added to genetic programming, the search space changes from the space of all possible computer programs composed of the designated primitive functions and terminals to the space of all multi-branch programs in which each branch has the opportunity to repeatedly invoke one or more previously defined branches. When we compare the distribution of hits among 1 million randomly created programs without automatically defined functions for the even 5 parity function to the distribution of hits among 1 million randomly created programs with automatically defined functions, we see more extreme outliers when automatically defined functions are involved. The same is true for the even 3, 4, and 6 parity problems, the Lawnmower problems with lawn sizes of 32, 48, 64, 80, and 96, the Bumblebee problem with 10, 15, 20, and 25 flowers, as well as the obstacle-avoiding robot problem, the minesweeper problem, and the artificial ant problem. This observed difference in outliers occurring at generation 0 reflects the nature of the representation, not the nature of the genetic operations that may subsequently occur. One of the reasons why automatically defined functions may reduce the computational effort to solve problems is that the leverage inherent from a representation that supports subroutine reuse is a better lens through which to view the world. Another reason is that crossovers that occur in subsequent generations in multiply referenced automatically defined functions provide additional leverage. Thus, we have seen that problems from complex, regularity-rich environments can often be efficiently solved by including automatically defined functions in the toolkit of genetic programming. The technique of automatically defined functions enables genetic programming to automatically discover useful functional subunits dynamically during a run. The concurrent evolution of functional subunits and calling programs enables genetic programming to realize, in an implicit manner, the entire 3-step hierarchical problem-solving process. Starting from a primordial ooze of randomly generated compositions of programmatic ingredients, genetic programming with automatically defined functions simultaneously evolves the functional subunits and co-adapted calling programs by employing the Darwinian principle of survival and reproduction of the fittest and genetic crossover. The evidence accumulated to date suggests that automatically defined functions work so well for so many different problems that anyone using genetic programming should try employing automatically defined functions on their problems.